Hello, everyone, and happy Friday. So good to see each of you. We're just taking a moment to allow our podcast community audience to build up. Thanks so much for being here. I'm Dr. Nika White, your host of Intentional Conversations VodCast, and we have been expecting you as we do every Friday around the 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time window. And it is our pleasure that you have saw fit to be a part of our conversations for today. I am being supported by my amazing team at Nika White Consulting, and we have no doubt that you could have had multiple things that you were planning to do during this hour, but the fact that you're spending it with us and rich and deep conversations around intersecting diversity, equity, and inclusion with leadership in business is something that we're really grateful for. So as you settle in, please go to the chat. Let us know where you're joining the conversation from. I think I see Chicago, so thanks so much for joining. It's always interesting to us to see where people are joining the conversation from. If you also feel inclined to share any other information about yourself, maybe even perhaps your LinkedIn information, that is your way of letting us know that you desire to be connected with this community beyond this window of time. And we do appreciate that. Our chat is also a way for us to create a sense of community as we learn with and from each other today. So make sure that as some thoughts are coming up, maybe some resources are coming up that you feel like would be of benefit to this community, please feel free to share. I also want to acknowledge the live LinkedIn audience that may be joining us today as well. We are so grateful in whatever capacity in which you may decide to be a part of today's conversation. Now, cameras are always encouraged, but certainly it's not mandatory. We do love to see those smiling faces, but if you desire to just be here in an auditory capacity as an observer, then we are grateful for you as well. Thanks so much for being here today. And again, this is Intentional Conversations. Once again, if you're just joining us, I'm Dr. Nika White. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am your host of Intentional Conversations, which is a vodcast brought to you by Nika White Consulting, where we intersect conversations around diversity, equity, and inclusion, leadership, and business. Not only do we bring this opportunity to you all in a vodcast capacity for those who desire to be a part of the live conversations, but we also take the audio and make it available in a podcast capacity. So if you know of others who would love to be a part of getting this information, and certainly share the opportunity with them to either catch the replay, join us live, or even check out the podcast. So we'll place that information also into the chat. Now, I've been sharing this with this podcast community because you all are very important to me, but book number 3 is about to release, and I'm so super excited about this. It is called Inclusion Uncomplicated. It's a transformation guide to help simplify DEI, to make it practical. Pre-orders are now being accepted, and it is available. This is in partnership with Forbes Book, and I am really excited to have your support, and I look forward to your thoughts once the book is available. So thank you in advance for your support. Now, here at Intentional Conversations VodCast, we like to give you a little bit of information for what you can look forward to in the upcoming weeks. And so Friday, September 9th, we'll be back here 11 a.m. again, and Sia Justice is going to be joining us. And in that conversation, we're going to discuss leveraging employee resource groups to improve employee well-being, create high potential talent pipelines, and to support and advance key business initiatives. And so join us on September the 9th for a conversation with Sia Justice. And then the week following, we will be bringing Andrea Tatum to our conversation podcast, and that's going to be on September 16th. Andrea does a lot of work around helping practitioners, or even those who are interested in being practitioners, to really find their lane and their niche within this broad body of work. And so I encourage you to join us if that's of interest, and also pass it along maybe to others that you feel like would value being a part of that conversation. Now, we always rely on great recommendations, and many recommendations have come from this community of individuals that we can invite to serve as a co-host. And so if you know of someone, maybe it's yourself, maybe it's someone else that you have been admiring and you've been following their work, We want to know about them. We are recruiting guests right now for Q1 of 2023. We are booked out the remainder of this year. But to make a co-host recommendation, you can send that to my colleague, Amora Carter, who is actually on the podcast today. And her email is simply amora@nikawhite.com. Now, it does me great pleasure to introduce our guest co-host for today, and I'm super excited to have her. I know this is going to be a tremendous conversation, so you all know how we do it here on the Intentional Conversations VodCast. I am going to provide her bio because I want you all to know her accolades, her credentials, how she shows up to this work in this space, and then I will invite Deepa to greet you in her own way, and she will share maybe some things that we would not necessarily know about her just by reading her bio. Deepa Purushothaman is a former senior executive and corporate inclusive visionary. She challenges and redefines the status quo of leadership, success, and power by centering the needs and experiences of women of color. As a senior partner at Deloitte, Deepa spent more than 20 years helping clients in the technology and telecommunications industries transform and grow. She also focused on women's leadership and inclusion strategies as the managing partner of WIN, Deloitte's pioneering, globally renowned women's initiative, and was the first Indian American woman and one of the youngest people to make partner in the firm's history. After leaving Deloitte in 2020, Deepa co-founded Information, a membership-based community for professional women of color, offering brave, safe, and new space and placing them in C-suite positions and on boards. Deepa's book, The First, the Few, the Only, I'm holding it up right now, How Women of Color Can Redefine Power in Corporate America, was published by HarperCollins in March of 2022 to international acclaim. Deepa is a TED and SXSW speaker and has been featured across multiple publications, including Time, PBS, Forbes, Wall Street Journal, Fortune, Financial Times, and Harvard Business Review. Do me a favor, VodCast community, and please, in your own way, go to the chat, pull those emojis, but let's please help show a warm welcome to our guest co-host today, Deepa, as I know she is going to really be a treat as we hear more about her experience and the work that she's doing. So Deepa, first and foremost, thank you so kindly for saying yes to our invitation. And I'm just delighted that you're here. I think it's also appropriate to mention that you're in LA, and so it's super early for you. We don't take that lightly, but we're so grateful. And so just greet this audience in your own way, Deepa, and just help us to know maybe some things about you that we wouldn't be able to learn just by reading or hearing your bio.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. And I can just see how warm and engaging the audience is just from that welcome. I don't think I've ever received a welcome like that I'm seeing in the chat. So thank you. And thank you for having me again. Just a few things that are not on the bio, because that's a long bio. I grew up in New Jersey. I grew up in a very small farm country town. And so, concepts of fitting in and belonging were always a real issue to me. I think we had 4 students of any sort of color in the school that I went to. And so really just big questions around belonging. Another fun fact is we moved from San Francisco to Los Angeles right before COVID. And so although I've been here now for 3 years, I don't really know LA very well because I haven't been out and about all that much. So that's kind of next on the horizon. And then we rescue animals. So, if I am not doing all of these things, I'm usually picking up poop or cleaning up throw up or something not very exciting in the background. And so currently we have 3 dogs and a cat. So yes, there's a lot going on in the house.
Fantastic. I love that. I love that. Rescue animals. Okay. So I want to jump right in because these hours, they always go by so fast. And there's so much that I know that this audience could gain value from learning and hearing as you and I engage in conversation. But you write that the structure of corporate America was not built for us or by us. What does that mean for women of color trying to navigate their careers, and what needs to change?
Yeah, a lot of what I'm trying to say when I say that, and I often say corporate America is not a meritocracy, like in addition to that, is trying to get people to understand that, we can only take responsibility for so many things. And I feel like your audience is going to be well-versed in this conversation. But sometimes when I have that discussion, people don't realize how much we have been told we have to work harder, we have to do more. And the women of color I work with are exhausted, are burnt out, or traumatized. They're at such a point of over efforting. And so part of the message that I'm trying to share is that, yes, there are certain things we can do and certain things we can, quote unquote, lean into, but there's a lot about the system and how it was set up that doesn't work for us. And so we should not take responsibility for those things, and we should draw our lines, because otherwise we're going to continue to be sick. So that's a little bit of what that means. I tell a quick story in the book that's just maybe helpful for context, where I sat down with Renee Myers. She's the VP of Inclusion for Netflix, and she's a good friend. And we started talking about airplane design. And she was saying when she was a young mom, when her kids were little, she would really stress out about having to put luggage overhead, because what if, during turbulence, it fell on her children's head? And she would think, like, why was it designed that way? And I shared with her, I'm 5'1", so I'm tiny. And when I used to fly, I used to do 3 cities a week. Like, the process of getting the suitcase on and taking the suitcase off 6 times a week was really stressful for me. And we had such a fascinating conversation about how in such a small space, here are 2 women of color having completely different experiences. She's tall, by the way. And so she didn't even think about the height thing. And so just like, it's a great example of how a space wasn't designed with us in mind. And at that time, when that space was designed, there were only 2 or 3% of Boeing designers who are actually women. So it makes sense to me. I think in the same way, workplaces weren't designed with us in mind, like the hours that we work, how we work, where we work, temperatures, table heights. There's a lot of like things about design that were designed for the male body, just to put, put it simply.
Right.
And so really understanding, again, what we take responsibility for and what we give back is so important in this work.
No, I love that, Deepa. And I think it becomes even more important to amplify that point around design and who was it really set up to create success for when we consider this distributed workforce environment that we're in, right? Oftentimes we assume that the work from home or the work remote is going to look the same way across each individual, and that's not the case. And so it certainly brings to the forefront the need for us to be much more intentional about all of those who are going to be impacted, and let those decisions about the design to inform that. So I appreciate that. I also love the use of the word over efforting. I took notice of that. First time I've heard that, but I love it. I think a lot of us find ourselves over efforting, especially, again, to your point, women of color, because we always feel like we have to show up a certain way. We always have to be like superhuman. We're not as much forgiveness and grace is extended to us when we make those mistakes. So I want to talk about the use of women of color, because I know that, again, as practitioner in this space, and Deepa, I know that you probably heard and have been a part of so many conversations, no one group is a monolith. And so sometimes when we use the labeling of women of color, it can tend to dilute some of the very unique and specific needs of certain populations within that broad category. So how do you navigate that as you've released your book and as you continue to express this really important messaging as part of your platform?
Yeah, no, and I love that you asked the question, and I love that this is a conversation set up.
Yes.
Because, by the way, there's no right answer to that, to that question. I'll be honest with you. I really struggled with writing a book on women of color. I really felt, and I sold my book 6 weeks after George Floyd's murder. And so I really struggled with, in that moment, that summer, could I even write a book on women of color? Did I have permission as an Indian woman to write that book? And I really struggled almost for the first 6 months. I remember I reached out to Minda Harts a number of times, and I was like, Minda, is it okay? Like, what is your advice? And I talked to so many people in the space. And eventually I just got to the place where there was a professor that I interviewed from UCLA. And he had a perspective, and it was not about women of color, but it was about people of color. And he's a political sort of professor. And so he was saying in political circles, he does use the term people of color because it actually explains some of the political suppression and some of the challenges that different groups can face when they're, quote unquote, in the out group. And that if you actually come together, there's more power in that. It doesn't take away from what he calls it a super identity. And he said, it doesn't take away from being, Black in America or Indian in America, but it's almost like a way we can come together and talk about some of the shared experiences. So I liked that sort of definition of it. It was an empowering way to bring us together. And what I found, and I should say I interviewed 500 women of color in writing the book, is that there were certain patterns and certain experiences that were shared in the workplace. I would not say our experience is the same in the world, but there are certain experiences in the workplace that are shared. And where I needed to make nuance, like I did say, Black women face this, immigrant women, by the way, have a completely different experience, especially if English is not your language. I try to call it out in the book where I could, but it was done in an attempt to kind of bring us together, because I think, by the way, a lot is done in especially corporate spaces, but workplaces, to divide us. Because when we're divided, then it's harder to kind of say this is a universal problem, that, a structure organization needs to fix. So for me, it's a term of power, but I know it's complicated and there's lots of perspectives on it. So
No, it really is. And I think that you do a great job of striking that balance. Again, I have not completed it yet, but I am in the midst of it. And I've noticed where there have been certain areas where you have called out with specificity, who are we talking about in this particular context when we are addressing kind of women of color. So I do appreciate that. You also mentioned Minda Hart. She is a great friend and to this podcast and to me personally. And so we've had her on a couple times. And I know that she is a big fan of yours and your work. I've seen her
I
talk
am
very
too,
highly. Yes, talk very highly about your book. And so I just wanted to bring that to the conversation.
Thank you.
So how do we begin, Deepa, to reframe the fit in and lean in mentalities that have left women feeling burnt out or isolated in the workplace? And as a follow-up to that, how can women of color move past the idea of working harder to get ahead?
Yeah, it's kind of a little bit in that over efforting, conversation that we started. And again, I think Minda, by the way, says this so well, where she talks about like, lean in doesn't work, especially for Black women, like that
Right.
idea to do more. And so one of the interesting things that I found in the research was that almost all of the women I interviewed were taught they were going to have to do more. The Black women I interviewed were taught they had to work 2 or 4 times as hard as their white colleagues, whereas a lot of the Asian and Latinx women I met were taught they had to work twice as hard. So there's a little bit of difference in how much effort, but it was literally always 99.999%, you're going to have to work harder. And that message we get when we're little and we carry it like throughout our entire lives. And so it's such a hard message. And it's a message of that you just have to accept that you have to do more. And one of the most surprising things, I don't know if you got to this in the book yet, but the most surprising things that I found in the research is that literally 2 out of 3 of the women I interviewed are physically sick. So they're literally having skin rashes. I'm hearing a lot of like hair loss, but skin rashes, heart issues, stomach pains, migraines, headaches, there's about 12, symptoms that I found over and over again. And they're physical manifestations. They're not just like, I'm not feeling well or I'm tired. It's a whole different level of trauma. And that's part of what's wrong with that lean in, do more mentality. And I think part of what I'm trying to make sure we understand is that get message is so early and so often that unless we unprogram it or deprogram it, it's easy to keep doing that and keep doing more. And so it's a really hard message. That was one. Another was don't rock the boat for certain communities. That was something that I heard often. And then, just be grateful. Like those 3 things I would say are probably the 3 things I heard most often. And I think are the most harmful things to women of color, because it's an unconscious or a soft message of like, just accept what's the status quo.
Exactly.
And I think it keeps us in our place, right? And that's not where we are today.
Yeah. And that's not our place. It keeps us in a place, but not our place. Yeah.
What they mean, quote. I just
no, exactly. I knew precisely what you meant. So I want to shift here a little bit because there's a big groundswell of interest and commentary that's happening around this phenomenon that's been labeled quiet quitting. And I know that you've also spoke a little bit about it in some of your social media posts. But what you just shared was that in interviewing these women for the book, so many of them articulate, which I felt this because it's been my situation too, that you have to always do more in order to just be on par, right? And so when I think about this movement that feels like it's starting to create a good bit of popularity among some populations, I do worry a little. I worry that for the women of color who are of this mindset that I do have to do more and show up a certain way and kind of outdo my, white male counterparts in order just to be on par. If we buy into this quiet quitting, which again, there's a whole lot of conversation around really what does that mean, because the nomenclature there is not perfect. But if they buy into that and they stop trying to really go hard and do above and beyond, what would that do in terms of perpetuating or not the conditions that so many people are gravitating to because it's just been how it's always been done?
Yeah.
Have you contemplated that? I'm curious about your thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. I have a lot of thoughts around it, in like short order. I agree. Like, and I see some of the comments. I don't like the term quiet quitting, and that's a lot of what I've been writing about.
I don't
either. But I also think that it is a really interesting concept. So we can come back to this idea, but I ended up getting really sick. That's part of why I ended up doing this research and I ended up writing the book. And for me, like one of the things I learned I literally spent 8 months in bed. I had to go see, 15 doctors. Like it was a long process. was if I was going to stay, I would have to do my job differently. Like I would have to not be chasing the next thing and really set different boundaries. I don't know if that would have come with ramifications, but it's just what I would have had to do to stay in that space. And so to me, there is a different way of working where you're always not chasing the next thing, and there's potentially ramifications, but I think that's the choice. And we don't realize that that's sometimes a choice, that we can choose our health or our boundaries or our families. But usually if you're in especially high charging sorts of environments, which I was in, you're taught there's only one way to do it. And I think that's part of the conversation. One story that comes to mind that I think really, speaks to this is this idea. There's a chapter in the book called The Job and the Job, how much extra work women of color do at work. And I literally talk about all the different kinds of roles. And there's one story that I always talk about because it still like gets me emotional. It was a Black woman that I was speaking to from the Midwest. And we were 45 minutes into a conversation and she started crying. And she said, until you started asking me these questions, I don't think I realized how much extra I do. And she said, I took this job 6 months ago. I knew I was the only Black woman in the department. I've come to find I'm the only Black woman in the entire company. And then this is where she got emotional. I moved my husband and my kids. We're one of the only, I think she said, 3 Black families in the entire town in the surrounding area. Wow. And so she said, I'm literally the only Black woman that a lot of my white colleagues have ever met. And then she did air quotes. I feel responsible for representing my race in a good way. And I've heard similar things from the Muslim women I've met, interviewed, from some of the immigrant women. So it's common, maybe the exact details of it are different. But she said, I change how I wear my hair, what I talk about, what I eat, like the pictures I have in my office. And she went through this really long list. And what was so crazy to me was that she is not a comms person or an HR person or in a role where those kinds of things maybe like is something she would think about. She's an accountant. And yet she felt so responsible. And so that's an example where I don't know if it's quiet quitting, but it's like she didn't want to take responsibility for that anymore. She's like, that's not my job, but I never even stopped to realize how much I was doing that. So to me, that's like more boundary setting or being really clear, the extra work that you're doing that takes a toll, that you are going to say, like, I just can't humanly do anymore. Like, that's not my responsibility in all situations all the time. So I think that there is something in between quiet quitting, which is a thing, to, more boundary setting, to women of color just saying no, in ways that are palatable. Because I agree, you can't say no to everything. And there's ways you can say no to things, which I've learned. I've been working with a lot of negotiation professors. And there are ways to set boundaries that I never did. Right? I never even thought about myself, that now if I could go back, I would say, yes, I'll take on that extra role, but I want this instead. Or next year, put me on this committee. There's ways you can trade to also get what you want, which to me is maybe a redefinition of quiet quitting. It's like, again, boundary setting, but we're not often taught to do that. We're taught to be grateful, right? And that gratefulness kicks us in the butt so often.
Oh, absolutely. Be grateful. You're here. You have a spot. Is that not enough? Yes. And that's harmful. That's harmful. So I, like you, I do believe that the labeling of this concept is challenged in many ways, quiet quitting, because, as we've expressed in different ways, it's not about someone quitting. It's about someone really leaning into those boundaries that are necessary. I'm also hearing, though, that as it relates to this concept, there's a population of people that really truly believe, instead of quitting, and I use the air quotes there because, again, it's debatable what that looks like and what that really means. Why not just shift and go to a different workplace where you can feel like, yes, you want to give your all? And I think that's problematic as well, because it's coming from a place of privileged thinking, maybe because of the experience of being in work environment to where you don't feel like you don't want to give your all, right? And it's easier said than done. I mean, yes, I do believe that women of color certainly have the agency to find other opportunities, but I'm also thinking that people are missing the mark a little bit and being so dogmatic about it, presumably being an easy thing to do just immediately. So I just want to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think it's missing the larger concept. I think that the last few years have unpacked for us, and for me, quiet quitting is more of a conversation about work not working for most people. I think that's really what it's underlining, right? Or highlighting, I should say. And I think what we're recognizing is that there are certain principles, I would say, and go as far, and I say this in the book, with capitalism, that I think a lot of us are just questioning. Like, look at the environment, look at what's happening to, in Pakistan, like literally this week, like there is just a situation happening where some of the ways that we do business and the values that we have as a world don't really match. And I think for women of color in particular, a lot of us grew up in cultures where there was more collective thinking. There was like more community success. And so there's like, for me, quiet quitting is really a values conversation, right? It's
Yeah.
almost like, how much are you going to let work take over your life? And is it priority number one? Or are we kind of saying, no, like you don't get to have all of it. I'll do my job. We're not saying I'm not going to do my job, but
Exactly.
I'm not going to sacrifice myself anymore. And that's, I think, the difference of what is really important to understand. Like, to me, it's a values flag, and
Yeah.
I'm glad we're having it. Again, I don't love the term, and I don't think it's always being conveyed the right way, but it's one that we need to have because the last few years have really unpacked a lot of what's broken in the workplace.
Yeah. No, really good conversation. So I want to move forward and I want to talk a little bit about some of what you have in your book. And I don't want to give it all away because I'm encouraging each of you. And again, we will place into the chat the book so you can purchase it for yourself. But you just shared a story of this woman who was the only, right? And so what is your main advice to women who are the first, the few, and the only? And then also, Deepa, as a follow-up to that, how did being the first for you shape your own workplace experience?
Yeah, so maybe I'll start with that because it's like
Mm.
the first question. So, I, like I mentioned, grew up in a completely white space, went to very elite institutions, and then joined Deloitte right out of grad school. And I was serving, as you kind of shared, tech and telecom clients. And so a lot of the people in the rooms I was in were men, right, and white men. And so I was often, definitely the only woman of color, and often the only woman. And so that sense of like not having other people that looked like me was really there. I think also for a lot of us, when you don't see yourself on television, don't see yourself in the media. I never saw a teacher that looked like me. There were hardly any women that worked outside of the home in the bubble that I was in, decades ago. You kind of get this message of what you can and can't be. And so for me, it was a really active sort of messaging around like, you don't have to see it to be it, which is the opposite of what I think we tell little girls today. And I
Mhm.
had to be really conscious. Like, I'm not going to see someone that looks like me, but I can
Mhm.
take like different pieces from different people and really create like how I want to show up. So I was
Yeah.
very intentional about the kind of leader I want to be. And I think
Mhm.
that also ties to what we were just talking about. Like, I think we've all been a little bit brainwashed of like how you have to be successful. And I understand, yes, there are certain expectations around us, but I think that sort of like, you have to be this way to be successful doesn't work for most of us. And that's why women of color are sick, or that's why people of color get to a certain level and are like, is this worth it? That's really for me like how this, the first few only all came about. So here I am, 16 years in my career, having bigger questions about purpose. And then all of a sudden I start to get sick, and it's like mounting
Mhm.
issues. You can share that story in a minute if you want, because I did have like a defining moment. And then I
Mhm.
started meeting with women of color because I wanted to just casually understand, like over, dinner, drinks, like where does one go after, 16, 20 years in one's career? Like, what's a good industry for women of color? Like, what should I be doing at the senior level? Like, people didn't quit my job at that point. Like, usually once you make partner, you stay because that's when
Mhm.
you're going to make more money. It's almost like you have tenure, right? Like, it
Yeah.
doesn't make sense to leave. And so I was looking for just advice. We ended up doing, and I did this with my now business partner, Ra. We ended up doing about 15 dinners across the country. Again, they were just networking dinners without a lot of like clear intention. And those dinners were what became the company, but also became the book. And it was one statement that a woman made in our first dinner that I heard over and over again. She was a CFO at a public company. So you can imagine like a really big role.
Right.
And she said, I sit in a seat of power and I don't feel powerful. And I
Mm.
heard that over and
Mhm.
over and over again from these women. And by the way, so I ended up meeting 300 senior women of color, almost all director level and above, VP level and above, because we went pretty senior. And they're all saying this. They're all finishing each other's sentences. They're all sitting in these dinners, I thought, for 1 or 2 hours, instead 6, 7, 8 hours, finishing each other's sentences, saying, I'm questioning if the sacrifice was worth it. I'm questioning if I'm having to conform too much and give up parts of myself. So to me, that's a lot of what this discussion is about. And being a first, a few, and an only, you kind of have been taught you have to behave, you have to, be
Right.
smaller than you are, that you have to fit in, you have to conform because the leadership that came before us didn't look like us.
Right.
And my message is that you end up in a situation where you're not happy, you're not pleased, and you're not feeling powerful. And so it does a disservice to you. But by the way, it also does a disservice to the company because you're not getting like our most innovative thinking and our full
Right.
selves. So that's really where that first few and only thinking comes from. You're the first in your family to go to college. You're one of the few in a department or a company, and you're the only, in a C-suite. And I have more words that I define it with, but it's that experience. And we should look at those women and we say, you're trailblazers, you're amazing. We don't ask them how hard it was. And part of my message is we need to talk about how hard it is, because I don't want to keep making one or two or three and like saying they're the exception. I want to say, like, what's holding us back from making many? That really should be the conversation.
Yeah, no, I love that. Yeah, let's get to the crux of the matter so we can really solve
Yeah,
this,
yeah.
right? Yeah, no, that's so good. And Andrea, I agree. She placed into the chat your statement of, I sit in a seat of power, but I don't feel powerful. Yes, that is incredibly profound. That struck me as well. So one of the things that I want to make sure we amplify is that while this book is about how women of color can redefine power in corporate America, it is not just a book for women of color. And I believe that we need to make sure that we are really just echoing that as often as we can. So if you could encourage white leaders, maybe white male leaders in particular, to read this book, what would you tell them that they can expect to learn from it?
And you'll appreciate this. So I'll share with you. Book came out in March, and I struggled for the first 3 or 4 weeks because every podcast or every journal, it got picked up quite a bit, but everybody who was interviewing me was a white man. And all the early feedback was from white male leaders who said, I don't feel comfortable. Like I've been told I can't ask any more questions. So I'm just going to go read the book to understand. There was so much interest and support from that community who I think wanted to understand. So I would say the book actually, surprisingly, I wrote it very specifically for women of color because there's not enough books written for us, by us. And so I don't like define things. I don't, had I known who was going to pick it up, I might have slightly written a different book. I literally wrote it for us. There's no, code switching is just this. Like, I don't explain what it is. And so I'm surprised, so in a good way, surprised. When I do these conversations now, and I've been in a lot of companies, I've actually probably been in 200 and 300 companies just since the book has come out, because people are really wanting to talk about this.
Right.
And one of the things I talk about in the book is microaggressions. And I say for women of color, racism, microaggressions and racist incidents, to me, that's a continuum, like they're not different things. I say often we have not been taught what to do or what to say in those incidents, right? And in those incidents, we often feel pain and shame, and we can't, sometimes speak up, or we're looking for other people in the room. And so I go through this exercise of, I want women of color to practice what they're going to say, and I want them to write it out, and then I want them to literally physically say it, because sometimes in that moment the shame takes over.
Yeah.
But what I've started to do is I call allies co-conspirators. I've started to tell white men, like, I want you to practice too, because one of the most surprising things, and I'll be curious if you have a different perspective on this, but in my research, most of us have not been taught, and I thought the Black women would have said differently, but most of us have not been taught what to do in situations that are racist or uncomfortable. Like, our families just told us it's going to happen, or you just move on, or just make the best, but we haven't literally been taught what to say or what to do. But what I'm learning is our white leaders haven't either. So if they're uncomfortable in a meeting, or they witness something, they also have been taught you should be nice. I think for the most part, that's kind of the undertow of what we've all been taught, right? Like, just, like, grin and bear it, or that's just, that's, be grateful, right? Back to the grateful, or that's what's going to happen. And so I tell white leaders, I want you to physically write out what you're going to say, 3 things. And then I want you to practice saying it, because it's sometimes hard in the moment when someone just says something inappropriate, and it can't fall upon you and I to do it all the time, because that is hard. So it's like, I'm really teaching people that in the moment, there are things that you can do that are the right thing to do, and they don't have to be aggressive and put everybody off. And we need more of us to do that. So it's almost, I've taken the book, and I feel like I've come up with a translation for white men that I was not expecting to do, but I also think that's how we make change. So I'm okay with doing it. I wasn't initially, but I am now. So.
No, I totally agree with your approach there. And I do believe that it can benefit individuals to be a part of conversations where tools are being introduced that they can put into their toolbox. So when they find themselves in that situation, it's not completely catching them off guard. This is somewhat familiar to me. I think I know I'm going to pull out of my toolbox. Well, tell me more about that. I want to understand your perspective. What causes you to feel that way? And I think that those tools are needed, because to your point, we aren't necessarily taught what to do in those situations, but I'm seeing more support of that type of learning and training, which I think is really useful. So I'm going to shift in just a moment. I want to be able to have our audience to share any questions they have directly for you, Deepa, or maybe any contributions to the conversation, you can do so by unmuting yourself, raising your hand, and I will add you as a spotlight. Or if you would like to just present your question into the chat, I will give you a chance to do that, and we'll bring that question to the conversation. I'm going to ask one more question, and then Tracy, I see your hand is raised, so you're the first person that I will call on. But Deepa, I want you to tell us about information.
Yeah.
Tell us about it.
Yeah, I will. And I was going to say, and Tracy's a member, so she can also weigh in. Information was created a little bit over a year ago. And, it was actually based on those dinners. So we did those dinners. Women would say it was the best thing they'd ever come to. When are you coming back to our city? I think originally when we envisioned it prior to COVID, we were thinking it might be more impersonal. We'll work with companies to like really, host spaces for their women of color. It'll be more in-person event related because we need community. And we had to get creative as the pandemic happened. So a lot of our programming is virtual. And we basically have conversations about the workplace, and we hold space for open discussions. I'll give you 2 examples. When Naomi Osaka stepped away from the French Open, I remember a really profound conversation about how do we set boundaries for ourselves that we had with almost like 60 women just in discussion. We did one this week where it was about like, what are some of the barriers that we have been taught that, that keep women of color like in our own mindset, like things like we're under-resourced or things like that we can't think bigger. So it's this conversation that we have, and I think it's discussions that we all think about, but we don't often have spaces to have them together. And it's been really impactful because we have them with women across all industries, US and Canada. It's been really, I think, helpful to the women to just see each other. Like that was the discussion we have. Like more of our women are asking for more money or bigger positions because they see other women asking. And there's just, again, because we're first few and onlys, often we're isolated. And so that's like one thing that we do. So community. The second is research. We did a big research project with Billie Jean King last year that got a lot of attention. And talking about what it's like to be a woman of color, but done by us for us. Like I think a lot of the research that's out there is about us. And so we want to change that. And then this fall, we're going to announce a big initiative to place women of color on boards. And we're going to work with the team to do that. So that's going to be our real focus, like community and holding kind of brave, safe space, more research, and then really trying to have more discussions about how do we make more space for women of color on board.
Great. I love that. So Tracy, I am adding you to the spotlight. I invite you to unmute yourself and share your question or your commentary for the audience.
Thank you. Hi, Deepa. Welcome to this platform. I often frequent this platform and I learn so much. I'm going to tease out a subject that we're dealing with in information, and I want to bring it out for the benefit of this group. And it has to do with white women. And you know that when we have programs that center on women of color or people of color, oftentimes the beneficiaries of programs that are supposed to be for us end up benefiting white women. And how do we center on where the need is the most acute while not alienating white women or white men in some cases? How do we make it so that it's not a zero-sum game and bring them along when we have a specific need that we can't compromise on? Do you understand the question?
Yeah, I do.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I think it's, and I don't have an exact answer, but yeah, let's talk about it because I think it's so important. So a couple of thoughts, and then I'd love to hear both of you also weigh in. So one is, I mentioned like women being sick was the biggest, learning from the research for the book. The second biggest learning, so number 2, and I say this in the book, was the feedback that I got on white women. So at the end of every single one of my interviews, of all the 500, I would say, is there anything else you want to share? And the women of color would like literally look at the floor, would drop their voice because there was shame involved in saying this. But can you talk about how as women, we don't help each other? And it's usually white women that are our biggest obstacles. That then became the research we did with Billie Jean King. So we interviewed 1,700 women, white women and women of color, to really unpack, like, why is it that white women aren't helping in situations where they can? And to your point, like, why do most programs, like board programs, have really helped white women? They actually haven't moved the needle on women of color. And so it's really understanding that. For me, it's like the bigger question, or the most important thing we have to do around inclusion is we have to get out of this idea that there's limited seats and that we're redistributing, like that there is a pie. Because I find this, by the way, especially more with white men right now, like there's a fear that if one of the three of us gets a chair, it's taking one from a white man. And it can't be a redistribution game. Like that can't be like what we're trying to talk about. We have to talk about how some of the processes, some of the philosophy doesn't work, and we need to remake that, not just that there's 12 seats. And so, one of the three of us is fighting for what we did a TED talk, Ron and I, we call it the broken chair. Like one of us is, fighting for the chair designated for a woman of color because there has to be one, right? Like that's not the mentality. So I think it's a real issue. And I think this summer has made, I think that a challenging question. I do think there's new conversations about women's, rights and like what it means to be a woman in the US, and what else is going to be infringed upon in the months to come. And so I struggle. Like I still think we need programs for women of color, but I also think there's like a revived conversation about women as well that feels really relevant this summer.
Yeah, Deepa, I'll just add that I think you're absolutely spot on. It's almost as though the pathway to success is perceived to be so narrow that it's not in women's natural, and particularly white women's natural inclination to say, let me lift as I climb, let me lean back, and try to make sure I'm pulling others up. And so it becomes a challenge. I also agree that I think the bravery of those who have been willing to call out what they are seeing, just generally around the harm that a lot of white women are creating consciously and unconsciously, is now I guess causing people to be more sensitized to it, which the conversation in and of itself, I think, is healthy because it's bringing attention to it, which I can appreciate. But yes, that was a tremendous question, Tracy. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I might just add one last thing, which is I've had this conversation with some white women and some who are brave enough to say this to me. Like, I think a lot of them feel like they never got all of their seats. They never got like a full chance. And all of a sudden now women of color are, joining the conversation. And so there's a little bit of like, I haven't gotten mine yet, and again, I just think that's a really dangerous way to see the situation.
Can I quickly add something? So where you were talking about the microaggressions and having concrete examples of what people could do in those situations, maybe we can start with a tip sheet or something, having conversations around what white women can do in certain situations. Because some of it, I don't even think people are aware of. That's just my 2 cents.
Yeah, no, that's a great suggestion.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks so much, Tracy. Okay, if you have any other questions, make sure you raise your hand or place them into the chat. We want to certainly bring it to our live dialogue today. So you started to tell us a story earlier. So I'm hoping this next question is going to jog your memory on the story that you wanted to share. But you talked about in the book, leaving your company. How did that thought process unfold? What was it that led you to realize I now need to step away?
Yeah, so I kind of shared, I was 16 years into my career. I had started to ask questions about purpose, right? I loved my job. I was moving quickly, I had all the things. But I was just questioning, like at the time I was single, like I was trying to figure out how was I going to make my life work, right? So I had these questions around purpose in my life. And then I started to get sick. And the story I was going to say is, I tell it in the book, I was at my 14th doctor. I got my final diagnosis. I have late stage Lyme disease. It's in recovery now. But I was at my 14th doctor and she's looking at me, and she's a doctor I see in San Diego because I travel. Like I literally live out of a suitcase. And I remember her looking at me like sideways because I literally brought my suitcase to the appointment, right? And she says, like, we can keep running tests. I agree something is wrong with you, but we have, I don't have a clear diagnosis for you yet. Or I think I can tell you what you already know. And I will never forget. She said, your job is killing you. And I want to ask you 3 questions. What would you do if you didn't do a big job like this? Do you feel like you have to have a job like this to be important or to feel valuable or to feel worthy? And, thirdly, like, don't you see you're just worthy being you? And I remember those questions landing so profoundly for me. And I think for a lot of the women I work with who are these high achieving, high performance, like we've been taught, to get our seats at the table, sometimes end up sacrificing some of that. And our worthiness is very much tied. And our parents were immigrants to this country. Worthiness is very much tied to success and stability, financial stability.
Absolutely.
And so then I had to go through a process of unpacking that. But I do think that that's a real challenge for a lot of us. Like and it's not even like money, it's stability. Like we come from communities where there's scarcity. And so we've been taught, do anything to not have that scarcity. And it sets us up again for like this challenge of overworking and over efforting. And so that was a real wake up call to me. And I think really started a lot of my exploration on this topic.
No, great. Thank you so much for sharing that story. And we are glad that now you're at a better place health-wise. And so thank you for sharing. Sean, you have your hand raised. And so I want to invite you to unmute yourself and to share your question or comment. Thanks for joining us.
Yes, it's so good to see you. So
You
good to be
too.
back. It's been a while, I know.
You.
I've been working hard though.
That's
And
good.
thanks to
Glad to
you for
hear it.
letting me grace your platform a couple years ago. Good morning to everybody on here. Good morning, Nika. Good morning, Deepa. I follow you on LinkedIn. It's an honor. So my question is, as someone, as a DIB consultant, trainer, and strategist that educates about the harmful effects of the patriarchal system, and I have a very interesting perspective. I really think that when you look at where we are in the world, men have been in control since, whatever origin point you want to trace it back to, depending on your beliefs. And I really think we need to turn over the helm to women for the next century to let, you fix everything that's wrong in this world. But a thing that I run into, and what I want to ask Deepa, my question is like, has she run into this? Has she noticed this? And how does she address it? Is my fear is that, a lot of women, whether women of color, or white women, have been through so much and go through so much to get to where they're trying to go, in their professional and personal life. And sometimes what ends up happening is it causes this divide, between men and women. And I remember a very good friend of mine, Brandy, I saw a post that she made. It's like, I really long for the days where men and women realize that we need each other, and it's like, and so I guess I said all that, I provided context to ask the question is, how do we bridge that divide? How do we bridge the divide where, we're especially for those that are of like mind, where we're trying to dismantle systemic oppression and patriarchal oppression. But there's a lot of women that have just, be honest with you, that have had it with men, in our BS, and like just don't want to deal with us and don't want us part of the process. Like, have you noticed that, and how do you deal with that?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I did not find that in my research. Like yes, and I'll be the first to say, like, I've been having moments in my life, especially after a bad breakup, where like I want nothing to do with it. But for the most part, I did not find that. I feel like, to be honest with you, and again, I think that's why this moment is so interesting. As a result of COVID, I know a lot of, like, I would say, of my generation and younger, men who are also questioning like what they've been taught, So to me, I come back to that values conversation, and I talk about this a little bit in the book, and I'll share, I do an exercise when I do keynote speaking sometimes where I stand, and I've written about this on LinkedIn, so you may have heard, I'm going to repeat a little bit, but I stand on stage and I say, I want you to think of a leader. I want you to think of a pilot, of a professor, of a politician, of a CEO. And I go through a long exercise. And almost by default, everybody in the audience, including women, think of like white men in their 40s, like with salt and pepper hair, like wearing a blue power suit, 40s or 50s. At the end of that entire exercise, I say, I want you to think of someone you admire. And almost and it's a much longer exercise. I'm taking like the unveiling out of it. But I say, like, I want you to think of someone you admire. And who is that? And almost everyone in the audience, men and women, will think of like their grandmothers or some maternal figure, like a Mother Teresa type of person. And so to me, like the fact that we think of leadership, right, or patriarchy as, powerful, or as like leadership, and we think of the people we admire, who are more, empathetic or emotional or lead in a different way, as different things, is part of the disconnect. So for me, I don't know that it's like as much that women don't want anything to do with men. I think we're saying like the things that we value, like the aggressiveness, the assertiveness, the competition, the, winner take all, those kinds of philosophies that we attribute to men and patriarchy, that we don't want. And that's broken. And I think I'm starting to see more men that don't want that either. So to me, that's the fight I want to have. It's the values and what we think is important, and like the patriarchy concepts. And it's less about men and women per se. Because I think we're in a moment where more of us are willing to say, like, that doesn't work. This doesn't even work for men anymore. You're all exhausted too in your own.
Yeah, and I definitely appreciate that. And I know, and I agree with you. I would say that, when you look at the data, like the data definitely, and the empirical data like definitely doesn't point to like it's just like that across the board. And that hasn't been my experience.
Yeah.
It's been more running into that in pockets.
Yeah.
And
There's
depending
pockets
on
of it for sure. Yes.
right.
Yeah.
And
But I
when
did
I
not
saw
find that in the research in general with these high performing.
it just interests me when my friend Brandy, who is a woman, a very, accomplished woman, when she posted that, I was like, aha. So that energy that I do run into every now and then is real because she posted it. But thank you for your response. So great analogy. Thank you.
No, and I think it's real. I'm not trying to deny that. I just think I don't know that it's as universal as sometimes we talk about in the media or we say. Like there's definitely pockets of it. And I'm not gonna say I don't get together with my girlfriends and male bash every once in a while.
Great. Thanks so much, Sean, for being here and for your question. I do appreciate that. Yeah, I think there is something to be said about, those of us who are really passionate about this work and making sure that we're centering the needs of the most marginalized. How can we do so in a way that holds people accountable, especially those that have the power and the privilege to be able to help shift and to adjust and modify these systems, but to do it in a way to where they want to engage because they want to be collaborative in doing so, and not because they feel shame, guilted, judged, or blamed, because sometimes that divide certainly can keep people on the sidelines, and we need everybody kind of engaged in this work. So I appreciate
I love that. I think that's so
yeah.
cool. Yep.
Yeah. So what's coming up for you next, Deepa? What do you have on the horizon? What else are you like really passionate about right now, beyond, of course, continuing the message of the first, the few, and the only?
Yeah, it's interesting. So yesterday was 6 months since the book has come out. So it just felt like a whirlwind.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you. I feel like speaking is going to pick up again. So August was a little bit quiet. It got quiet just because of where we were in the year. And then September, October, November, I'm back to the circuit again a little bit. And then I'll be honest with you, I am starting to pick up and really ask what's the next book. I loved writing. So it may not be clear from this. I'm an off the charts introvert. So if I could sit in my house and like just write and never, go speak again, I'd be okay with that. And so I'm thinking about what's next. What does that look like? And, trying to figure out, is it another focused book on women of color? So I'll ask this audience. So please, message me on LinkedIn or whatever. Or is it larger? Like, is it more about leadership? And I'm torn. I think we still need more books on, about women of color, but I also want more of us to step into larger conversations about leadership, because we know more than just women of color or DE&I topics, which is also a little bit of what's happening. So that, and then I'm going to do a little bit more teaching. I'm actually going to be an executive fellow at Harvard Business School. I'm switching over here. And so I'm doing some more to really strengthen and talk about programming for women of color there. So excited about that.
That is amazing. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. So we do have some additional time left. So if there are any questions from the audience, certainly feel free to raise your hand or place it into the chat. I want to make sure that we can capitalize on this moment in time with Deepa. While we're waiting to see what's coming up for people, I do want to ask you about some ways in which you're seeing workplaces evolve with all of these, new and additional concepts that are like quiet quitting or kind of surfacing. What are you seeing, or some of the ways in which organizations are starting to evolve that you feel like serves society best?
Yeah, I think the beginning part of this, I just want to be clear, I think it's going to take a long time. Like, I don't think this is as simple as, companies just start doing it, or they have me or you come in for one conversation and it's all solved. I think a lot of companies are kidding themselves, to be honest with you, and where they are in the process, and that this is going to take probably, more than a decade to solve, because it took us decades to get here. I am excited that I think more people are having the discussion, but I think it's a lot about creating better and safer places for people to really tell their truths. Like, there's a lot in the book about how women of color are truth tellers, right? And how we don't often get to tell our truth about the workplace, and that the policies and processes actually in place hurt us when we tell our truth. So I think for me, like, my advice to companies is, one, you need to get better at listening and hearing, because just because you hold like a forum, like for people to share, doesn't mean like sharing is happening. Right. And two, like, we really need to really figure out how we change processes, like reporting processes, for example. around racism are completely broken in companies. There's actually more pushback and more retaliation than actually truth telling in those systems. And so really unpacking that. So.
Yeah. No, I love that. Linvor, I see your hand up. One of the things that I'm hoping we can come back to before we close out today, Deepa, is the broad conversation that's happening around the intersection of DEI and justice work. And so I want to hold that thought. But Linvor, I would love to spotlight you. Thanks for being here. Share your question or comment.
Thank you. Can you hear me good?
We can.
Okay, great. Thanks for coming on today. I really have enjoyed your conversation, the questions and interaction, etc. I'm curious because I think you were a partner at Deloitte and have had a lot of work with the accounting firms in general, the Big Four, the Big Eight. And I know Deloitte has done some deep diving into the DEI space, even before it was called DEI, and during your time there. So I'm curious about, is there a book, since that question came up, dealing more specifically with an industry that hasn't been as diverse as they have had the desire to? Because I think there's some lessons learned that can be pulled from the accounting industry per se and apply other places. And then also, what were some of the keys to your success and your longevity in that particular organization as well?
Yeah, sure. Yes, Deloitte has been kind of at the forefront of a lot of this work. It's part of why my WIN role was like such an amazing role to have, because the Women's Initiative was started in the 70s. It was started before it was a thing in most companies, and it was one of the first places where something like that was started. So yeah, they're definitely, groundbreaking. They do a lot of research similar to like McKinsey in these spaces. And I would say McKinsey has an amazing research on topics around this as well. I always wait for their fall reports that are going to be coming out soon, on women in the workplace in particular. I would say that there's a lot written around tech, obviously, like that, the bro culture. And that's one space where I think there's some learnings and a lot of, people trying to do interventions. And then financial services would be the other place where I think those are the two industries where there's just such disparity, and that there's more conversations I'm seeing about those two spaces than others. But I agree with you. One of the reasons I'm so interested in the academic role that I have is I find that there's actually a lot of research that a lot of academic institutions have had, but for whatever reason, it's not getting to companies. So they literally have done research where they have, had people in situations and done lab work for like a year or two, and they've published papers, but I never in my Deloitte role ever saw any of that research because there's such like a wall. So I actually think more than even across industry, like going to some of the academic research in this space is really important, because there's some professors doing profound work in that space.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate that.
Thanks, Linvor. We appreciate you being here. So Deepa, I do want to, in the few moments we have left, to get your commentary on, again, this conversation that seems to have of late surfaced with great level of passion and interest among so many around the intersection of DEI and justice work. Do you see them connected? Do you see them as separate bodies of work? What's your take on it?
I saw that post that went viral that Lily did.
Yes.
It's interesting. I guess the way I see it is that I don't see them as separate things, but I think that there's a lot more to the justice work that the DE&I work isn't solving for. So it's almost like a part of the justice work, but I don't necessarily feel like a justice practitioner, because I feel like I'm very focused on the workplace. I'm very focused on particular issues. And a lot of the justice work is really more about, in my mind, like a little bit more radical, a little bit more in your face, a little bit like of larger issues that absolutely need to be addressed. And so I don't think they're two different things. Like there were thousands of comments, but I almost feel like folks like Michelle Kim and others do a little bit more in the justice space, even though they do D&I work. Whereas I feel like it would be wrong for me to say that I do justice work, because I don't really step into those spaces as much.
Very much respect that. Thank you so much for your thoughts. So we have 2 minutes left, and I would love for you to do the honors of closing us out. And so a question that I tend to present at the end of the hour of time is, what have we not talked about today that you're having a lot of energy or passion around, that you want to socialize with this community? I want to give you a chance to share that.
Yeah, I did a post a couple of weeks ago, and I keep coming back to it because it's still getting a lot of attention. I did something where I said I didn't want to be the best anymore, that so much of my life was focused on being like the best, right? The best schools and the best jobs and doing the best I could. and that is all really exhausting. And like, so if
Mhm.
we're not really focused on being the best at things anymore. And also, by the way, that's kind of feels like a very empty thing to chase. What do we
Yeah.
want to replace that with? And so I guess my question to the group, or the thing I want to leave us all with, is a lot of what was the undertow of our conversation today was value. And as we step away from the values we have all been taught to chase, right, in capitalism and corporate America in particular, what do we want to replace that with? And to start to think about those things and think about how you show up in those ways in the workplace is my kind of question to the group, or my parting thought.
I love that. I love that. Yes. And that's certainly something that we all should be spending some time in self-reflection around the values piece, because it really should be the core of all of our decision making around how we show up and what we attach ourselves to. And so, Deepa, thank you so very much for gracing us with your presence and your wisdom and your thoughts. And I hope that each of you in this community will go out, if you haven't already, and purchase the first, the few, and the only. You will not regret it. And we look forward to continuing to follow your success and the work that you're doing. And we're just grateful that you took the time today to share with us. So thank you so very much.
Absolutely.
If each of you that have been a part of today's Intentional Conversations community, if you found the information to be helpful, then I do encourage you to share it out with others in your network. We hope to see you back here next Friday for Sia Justice for another hour of Intentional Conversations. Have a great, safe, and healthy weekend. And we look forward to seeing you soon. Thanks so much. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you.